we are going now to discuss a fascinating issue, which is who is behind the products that we buy and the goods that we consume. In April last year, the collapse of a factory complex in Bangladesh at Rana Plaza killed almost 1,200 workers. And it was a wake-up call for many, many people that in the collapse of a factory, you could damage your brand immensely. But it's not only a question of brand, it's a question of slavery in the supply chains. As I explained this morning, most of the big companies in the world have outsourced considerably their supply chain 30 or 40 years ago, their production to developing countries without paying enough attention down the chain. And today, they have the difficult issue to try to clean it from slave, because this is where it has been hidden. So the fashion industry that was hit by Rana Plaza is far from being the only one under scrutiny. Recent reports have showed us very clearly that, and we did at the last conference, Trust Women conference last year, how Nepalese workers are treated like slaves in Qatar, paid 45p an hour and working minimum 15 hours a day under excruciating sun, or Burmese immigrants in Thailand, trafficked, beaten, abused, enslaved to fish the prawns that end up on our plates. The sad truth is that slavery is part of the modern supply chain, as we know, and they have become increasingly long and complex. And companies are often outsourcing responsibility to third-party certification schemes that often don't guarantee much at all. You have to know who is certificating you, who is doing the audit, and do it properly. So how can we make sure that companies don't sell us products made by slaves? How can companies successfully address the issue of slavery in their supply chain? What is the damaged reputation for brands? This is, as we said, a very complicated issue, and most companies are shy about it because it's just very difficult to tackle. We are not here to criticize them. We are here to help them find ethical solutions. We are here to hear from those who have already started to address the issue, and we are here to press the others to do the same. I would like you to take 3 minutes to look at the introductory video that explains the issue.
How many slaves work for you? That's right, slaves working for you. Take a closer look at the goods that make up your daily life. Who made the soap you wash your face with each morning? Stitched the shirt that you wear? Carried the beans on his back that are now in your coffee cup? Or minds the tantalum in your car, in your smartphone, in your computer? Today, you don't have to live on a plantation to employ slaves. Global corporations can do it for you by subcontracting work out to low-cost producers, some of which rely on child labor, forced labor, violence, and exploitation. Walk Free Foundation estimates that 35.8 million people are working in slave-like conditions around the world. Over 23 million, or 66% of the world's slaves, are in Asia Pacific. There are over 5 million in sub-Saharan Africa, 2.6 million in Russia and Eurasia, over 2 million in the Middle East and North Africa, and almost 1.3 million in the Americas. Their work generates $150 billion, 3 times the profit of Apple. Slavery was abolished in Europe over 200 years ago, and international laws and declarations against slavery have been in place for over 80 years. But too many countries have neither the will nor the means to enforce these laws. Because global corporations are richer than some countries, they have a crucial role to play in fighting modern-day slavery. Apple is taking on debt bondage by requiring labour suppliers to refund excessive recruitment fees. They say they returned $3.9 million to workers in 2013. Intel spent 5 years examining its mineral supply chain in Congo and claims to have cut all ties to mines financing fighting in the region, mines that have been shown to rely on slave labour. And after the fire at Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, 150 fashion brands signed a building safety accord and pledged to hold their suppliers to account. These kinds of actions are just a start. A lot more can and should be done by corporations.
Okay, so to moderate this panel, we have Martina Vandenberg. I've said that a lot since the beginning of this conference, but she's also a very good friend of Trust Women. We do a lot of things together. One of the things we did together was the Banks Alliance with Cyrus Vance and Martina. When she spoke at the first session, she said to all the general counsel of the biggest banks in the US seated there, when I look at you, I don't see money, I see data. And they were very surprised. So she created, she's the founder and the president of the Human Trafficking Pro Bono Legal Center, the leading US institution aimed at supporting the victims of human trafficking through access to justice. And what Martina does is prosecuting the traffickers and getting financial compensation for the victims. So she does a fantastic job, pro bono. Through her career, she has shown true leadership in the fight against human trafficking and has won many, many awards for that. Martina has also been instrumental, as I said, to what we do at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, at Trust Law, and at Trust Women. So thank you for that. On her panel, you have a lot of very interesting people. You have Jean Baderschneider. She's the former vice president of global procurement at ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil is the second biggest supply chain in the world. Jean is also the chair of something which has just been created, which is the Global Fund to End Slavery. This is a fund that will be financed by her company and Andrew Forrest. And it will be a lot of millions of dollars injected in the fight against slavery. So I think it will be announced in a few months. Bennett Freeman is the Senior Vice President, Sustainability Research and Policy at Calvert. Calvert is a very big financial institution in the US, and it's a long time that they have decided to give loans to companies after looking at their supply chain and making sure that there is no slaves in the supply chain. An example to follow. Livia Firth is the very powerful creative director of EcoAge and founder of the Green Carpet Challenge. She has taken so much at heart what happens in the fashion industry that she's going to speak of that, because today I wanted to have on stage representatives from the garment industry. None of them accepted to speak. So she will do for them. Louise Nicholls is head of responsibility of responsible sourcing at Marks & Spencer. Marks & Spencer is a company which controls almost all of their supply chain. So they are in a very good position, I must say. And it's quite exceptional, but she has very interesting things to say. Renato Bignami is the labor inspector program for the eradication of slavery in Brazil. And Renato has done some extraordinary work in Brazil to prosecute slavers. Simon Constantine is the head of ethical buying and head perfumer, so he's a nose, at Lush. Lush is a very interesting cosmetic company. They have stopped to use mica in their cosmetic, in their lipsticks, etc., discovering that so many children were working as slaves in mica mines like Manan this morning in India. So, good luck.
Thank you. Many, many of you have this in your purse. It's just a regular lipstick. And as Monique just said, you heard this morning from Manan Asari, whose best friend was trafficked and who was trafficked into the mica mine. His best friend died so that our lipstick could have glitter. It is in all of our purses. Monique said that some of the corporations are shy, that some people are shy. Luckily, we have a panel today of rock stars of corporate accountability who are not shy. And so I've asked each one of them to give an introduction about their approach to corporate accountability and ending slavery in the supply chain. So we'll begin with Jean.
Thank you, Martina. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be here on this panel with extreme talent and great experience. By way to start, let me just reemphasize some numbers that Monique used earlier today. 36 million of slaves, 150 billion with a B of profits, and the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years indicates it's considerably higher than that, so let's say $500 billion with a T. And a recent effort shows that of all the OECD countries, in total, they spend 125 million with an F, or with an M, sorry, Freudian slip. Whoa! That was a Freudian slip, I must admit. But that's not a fair fight, right? It was an F or not a fair fight. For all of you who went somewhere else, I was talking about it's absolutely not a fair fight. And it is the reason why I start out with those numbers, it's the reason why businesses have to engage. Because businesses have a purchasing power of $80 trillion. They buy things, they buy services, they buy raw materials. It is that purchasing power that has to be mobilized to get a step change in the fight. Now, I think what we often do is we let businesses off the hook when we start talking about this because we don't talk specifics. So bear with me to talk a little technical procurement with you all about what we should be forcing businesses to do. So I'm just going to give you a few things. First, robust supplier qualification processes. Every single company should have a robust supplier qualification process and a supplier authentication process that includes site visits so that they know exactly what's going on. And that means when they do an RFQ, that RFQ includes clauses about no forced labor in your supply chain. So, and that also means their bidding practices. When you bid, you need to bid conditions. You need to have conditions on your bid that says there is no forced labor in your supply chain. They need clear accountability straight down through the supply chain. So it can't be tier 1 and we're done, or tier 2 and we're done, and tier 3. It has to roll all the way through the supply chain. Third, monitoring of suppliers. I believe audits are lagging indicators, not leading indicators, but company monitoring of their actual suppliers. We all do it, but when you're thinking about forced labor, you have to monitor in unannounced ways, and the biggest factor is you have to ensure there's direct pay of employees if you're monitoring for forced labor. Employee awareness. 7 years ago, when I got involved in this space because of an incident coming out of Angola on a Saturday night, I went back and started talking to my organization. It changed their lens. They started picking up things all over the world, and we operated in 150 countries. They started picking up things. We started looking very carefully at our supply chain. And finally, what companies really need to do is to be able to engage in a risk assessment. Unfortunately, we haven't had the capability in the past to do clear risk assessments, and Made in the Free World is now creating a toolkit, and my call to action is come up and talk to me afterwards, and you can be involved in beta testing that toolkit. Basically, what you do with that toolkit is you take your spend by product, by location, by industry, and you map it against data to get a heat map of where there's a high probability of slavery in your supply chain. And then, guess what? You get to go look at it, analyze it, and take action. When I did it first time manually, we found gravel in Angola. What's gravel in Angola? Well, anybody that understands gravel, and you saw it earlier today, it's produced many times by child labor. And so that allowed us to then begin to take some action as well. 2 other final comments. Those are the demand side, companies being involved on demand side. We also, I think, need to hold companies in conjunction with governments responsible for supply side. That means you train, you educate, you invest in local communities so families can earn a living and not have to sell themselves and their family or children into the slave trade. And finally, a concept I started using last year is the replacement economy. We can end slavery and take people out of slavery, but what happens then? What happens then? We have to effectively build in conjunction between businesses and governments replacement economies. So workers who come out of slave conditions have fair wages, fair working conditions, they participate in the community, they participate in the economy. We need global standards on that. And Monique mentioned, I just took over as CEO of the Global Fund to End Slavery. Part of our mission is to create government plans, costed national plans, that begin to understand what we need to do with the replacement economy as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Renato.
Oh, thank you, Martina. And I should thank you, Monique, as well, for inviting me for this conference. And last but not least, of course, I should thank Ben Skinner for introducing me to these wonderful people and this wonderful group who really wants to make a difference. Well, I should tell the story of Brazil. Brazil, at first, recognized officially slavery in its territory in 1995. It happened not voluntarily, but it happened after a civil society organization sued Brazil, the state of Brazil, in Organization of American States, saying that Brazil was neglecting to protect Brazilian workers in rural areas in the Amazon. Following that, a settlement was settled, and Brazil recognized slavery and started to take action against it. The first model was to create a special mobile unit who was inspecting a place independently from all the government pressures and political pressures, meaning that a political commitment was taken, but was taken after civil society pressures, so that's a very important point. Our model has been evolving ever since. And in 2003, we developed a name and shame policy, which is called the dirty list. Every company that is made liable for slavery within their supply chain goes to this dirty list for 2 years. And of course, they don't get public funding as well from the public banking system in Brazil. In 2007, my team and I, we started to work in order to show that slavery was happening not only in rural areas in Brazil, but also in urban areas, in different sectors and industries. And ever since, we rescued so far more than 400 workers from industries such garment industry, construction fields, restaurants, and other diversified urban industries. Well, I'm saying that just to make a very important reflection here. I was looking at the WTO website yesterday, and they have this interesting number. When you take the 500 wealthiest companies in the world, they are accountable for 70% of the global trade nowadays, but they employ less directly, less than 1% of the whole workforce. So I'll tell again. 500 wealthiest companies are accountable for 70% of the global trade, and then they employ less than 1% of the workforce. Another interesting number, from this, out of this 500 companies, only 22, less than 5%, are led by women. This is a very strong number too. Less than 5% are led by women. Well, that says much about this huge income imbalance, income inequality that we are facing nowadays. That certainly drives to more human trafficking and forced labor within these supply chains. Well, I think so. That's what been taking our reflections and our efforts there in Brazil nowadays, like to try to build up a model of legal liability of these companies over their supply chains, not only CSR policies, but also regulation and legal liability towards supply chains. That's the ultimate goal that we have there in Brazil. And I think that, well, going towards the end of my presentation already, I think that we need to take some lessons from these big cases, which is that if we can put our efforts in a few points to be fostered by this group, one should be, of course, to strengthen civil society organizations that really can make the difference. Another important asset would be advocacy from these groups, not only political action, but also advocacy, legal action. Transparency is also very important, and free media as well. So I guess these are the main products that we have from this case. It's very interesting to debate it, and well, I think action is needed. Some action is needed. I don't want to end up my days saying that the more I know human beings, the more I love my dogs. I really don't want to end up like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Renato.
You all.
Louise?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here today, and I can't help feeling that Monique's brought together a group of individuals who together we could really drive some collective action this afternoon. So I think that's really important. And I would just add to the comment, it's so important that we hear from the survivors. I do think it's really key you are part of the solution. So thank you very much for your bravery for coming today. So just set a little bit of context about Marks and Spencer's, and I'm talking very specifically about the food side of the business. We have about 600 first-tier suppliers. We use about 3,000 raw materials from over 10,000 producers and hundreds of thousands of smallholders in 50 countries. So it just sets a little bit of context. Quite a small supply chain compared with some of our competitors. We redevelop about a third of our catalogue every year, and so we work very, very closely in partnership with our suppliers, and we're really interested in the provenance of those raw materials. So just setting a bit of context, I get to travel the world, and I'm very lucky to do that, and I get to go and talk to workers and to suppliers and to NGOs and to trade unions and to governments around the world about ethical issues, and we've been working very actively at ethical trade for the last 15 years. What I see around the world is that the food supply chain is incredibly dynamic. We're seeing an increasing reliance on temporary and migrant labour, and that we're seeing that people are prepared to travel for the promise of work. And often that means that in that travel for the promise of work, they're reliant on some middlemen, and we are seeing an increasing number of unscrupulous middlemen. And just to add to some of the comments about what the survivors talked about earlier on today, what we're seeing is these individuals arrive for a job that was not what they were promised, that they arrive and they go into debt, and that debt is compounded by amazing levels of interest. Often that job the job links them to a work visa, or it links them to accommodation that is overcrowded and expensive, putting people further into debt. And if they try and complain, they suffer both physical and verbal violence, and that makes them very, very frightened. So I've got 6 points to make for the supply chain about how we can take action. The first point I would make is this is a very difficult issue to detect. I don't say that in any way to suggest that we should be complacent, but I think we do need to recognise it is difficult, and therefore you can't think that just because I've asked the questions that's enough. enough. You've got to keep asking, and you've got to keep raising awareness internally and externally and engaging with others. Now, Jean's covered very much that bit about mapping the supply chain, but it is key to map the supply chain, really understand where you could have third-party contractors involved, where you might have migrant labour, and therefore you could have labour brokers and gangmasters involved, to really develop a very clear code of conduct, but to absolutely link that into how you do business. And again, Jean was really clear about that. We're going to talk, no doubt, a bit more about audit, but the key bit for me is making sure that audit is fit for the job. If you are looking at auditing labour providers or gangmasters, do those auditors have the skills? And what we found in the case of the UK is that we tried a voluntary mechanism, but because they didn't have access to the information to know whether or not tax evasion was going on, to know whether or not those IDs were really fraudulent, they couldn't do an effective job. And that's what led to us lobbying for the Gangmaster Licensing Authority. But it's not just about the audit, it's about making sure that you make really effective corrective actions when you uncover those non-compliances. Remediation, repatriation, we've heard some of that again talked about by some of the victims. But it's more than that. Once you understand and you've got a monitoring program, what are you doing to really address those root causes and to build capability and capacity? And I think the last point is we cannot do this on our own. We must work with other multi-stakeholder initiatives. And I'm sure we might well come back and talk about some of the great progress that's being made by some of those initiatives.
Hi. My journey into fashion was a very personal first step. First of all, fashion encompasses all industries, from agriculture, with cotton farming, for example, to cattle ranching for leather, sheep grazing, wool. Then you move into the spinning, weaving, dyeing. Then you go into the cut and trim army of millions of labor to make the garments. So production supply chains are very, very, very complicated. But it's the cut and trim industry that was particularly interesting to me. And it's the first time in my life that I realized the link between fashion and human rights and slavery. When I went to Bangladesh in 2009 to visit a factory that was producing clothes for a brand that I won't name, but that we all know very well. And I was shocked because I arrived in Dhaka and there was an armed guard at the door. They checked our bags to make sure that we didn't have cameras. But the armed guard meant that no worker, and they were all women, could come in and out of the building without authorization. So they were entrapped there until the boss decided that the workday was finished. The women were working, they had to produce 100 pieces an hour. And in 2009, I can't remember what the living wage was, the minimum wage. But I can tell you that this year it's been raised to $60 a month. And as a result, from 100 pieces an hour, now they have to produce 120 an hour because the living wage is higher. The windows were barred. Basically, these women were enslaved, entrapped in this building. The toilet break was twice a day, no more than that. So I was completely shocked. And I thought, hold on a second. This is the first time they realized that we as Western shoppers are responsible for the life of the women on the other side of the world. They're like ghosts. Nobody knows of them. The companies have, make sure that we are so divorced from who produces the clothes that we never think about them. So from 2009 to today, we all know, and Monique referred to the Rana Plaza disaster too, the factory collapse, which was the biggest industrial accident in history. But there are incidents like this every day around the world. So I started to say, how can we change this? And then I realized that actually we can't change anything until we address the issue of fast fashion and fast food. But in my case, I'll talk about fast fashion. Because what happened was, as we have been part of a big Machiavellian game, because fast fashion is a pretty recent phenomenon, it's the last 15 to 20 years. And fast fashion corporations have been outsource their productions to poor countries. So Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia. And what they do is they enslave these countries with by having them become addicted to the idea of enrichment. But in fact, they're like a very good pusher, right? They're selling, they go in the country, they make very good deal with the prospect of, wonderful growth and taking the population out of poverty. And then once they get addicted, they start pushing costs down with large volumes. And so you can't get out of this mess because they are like we are all enslaved, because also then the fast fashion corporations act as distributors. So they've enslaved us as consumers to the idea that we can have faster and ever cheaper fashion, at which cost we saw with Rana Plaza. So you can't have trade at the expense of human rights and human dignity. And unless fast fashion addresses the issue of its core business model, we will never get rid of slavery in the fashion industry, ever. No matter how many audits, how many things. Take an example like Zara is part of Inditex. They handle 1 million garments a day. A day. They produce 10,000 looks a year. Who needs 10,000 looks? Who? And so we have been playing this game as well. And what makes this big corporation multi-billion-dollar empires are not poor people who can't afford the clothes. It's us who can go there and buy a dress a week, two dresses a week, so that we can always constantly be funky and trendy. But we have been taken for a ride. So we have to, as consumers, stop this, and it is in our power, to do this. I always say when people ask me, how can you change that though? It's like, well, commit to wear something a minimum of 30 times. But you would be, it's very interesting when you talk to women, most of them, they don't wear something even twice or 3 times. And there was a big report that showed that the average garment stays in a woman's wardrobe for 5 weeks. So when I spoke to Nazma, a union worker in Bangladesh this year in April for the anniversary of Rana Plaza, she said, can you please tell me why women in your part of the world consider my life cheaper than theirs? And that's the big question that no auditing can address, but this is the reality. And so we need to talk about that later, possibly.
Yeah, I really agree with all those points. I have 2 young girls at home who are just about ready to fill up their wardrobes with useless Primark stuff. I shouldn't mention brands, but it just...
No, we have to mention.
Yeah, I think, and I think that's part of the reason why I'm not ashamed to sit up here and talk about instances where we've had ingredients that maybe haven't fit in with our core ethics, and then we've had to deal with them. And I think that's really what the part the business can play, is that they can listen to consumers. We're very lucky at Lush to have plenty of consumers who know their minds, maybe too many sometimes because there's a lot of feedback. But actually, it's all very good, and very often, and very often we then need to act on that. Mica is a very good example, and I know you've been talking about that this morning as well. For us, that was a new line for us. We were launching colour cosmetics, and we started to use mica, and it's wonderful for glittery products, things that people like to buy, and you can sell those products, and people can turn a blind eye literally to that. But when we then found out what was actually happening, and then there was an article in The Guardian where we were questioned as well, we realised that actually we've got to do something about that. And that's not uncommon for that to happen to us. Similar kind of supply chain to yourself. We have nearly 2,000 raw materials and in many different countries, and it's really difficult to keep track of every single one of those. And we're going to get caught out, and we may even get caught out again. But that's not where we want to be, and we have to then act on it. And so a business can act on it You don't just have to kind of cover it up. You don't have to hide in the back and think, oh no, that's bad, but we try and keep a lid on it, plus it's going to hit our profit margins. So for Myco, as an example, we found that there's an alternative and that we can then use that alternative, which is quite straightforward. We're still having to work through our old stocks of Myco, and we're still implementing that in throughout the entire supply chain. But this happens to us relatively regularly. I've been working in buying for 10 years, and I'm a perfumer by trade. I've learnt it through working at Lush. A bit odd for a perfumer to be involved in supply chain, but quite early on I realised that the quality of your ingredients, and then how they're grown or cultivated or extracted, and then the people that are involved in that, you suddenly realise that these people are your partners, and that these people on the ground doing all the hard work and actually either growing that ingredient, mining it, or whatever, are the ones who actually put themselves out there. And it's not easy. And so we spend a lot of time now, as part of our buying team, we spend a lot of time on the ground. And I really agree with kind of, okay, there's an audit process, and they've got all these different kind of parameters, but being on the ground really helps quite a lot. Just last week I was in Kenya personally, and I was meeting with a similar sized group of Kenyan farmers and talking to them about potential for growing ingredients and kind of meeting them and understanding that. And a lot of our team do exactly that, and I think that's kind of one of the core things. My other feeling is that the supply chain isn't really holistic enough, doesn't look at the bigger picture. So you can look at one instance, so you can look at slave and bonded labor, or you can look at environmental devastation and damage, or you can kind of look at all these. And for us, we're trying to work on a much more holistic approach, where we can also take into account the human needs, the environmental needs, the business's needs, and trying to wrap them into something that is truly sustainable, maybe even regenerative, depending on where we're working. And I think and for us, that's a significant shift from just being sustainable and making sure that you can keep doing the same to something that's actually building and that people can lift themselves out, and you can all be a part of the world you want to live in, basically. And so that's really where we're working, and we're hoping to be part of the kind of businesses that can be used as an example for that. And that's why I'm not really ashamed to sit up here and talk about mistakes we've made and the fact that we've had to take action around that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. First, I just want to thank Monique for inviting me, and I'm delighted to join this panel moderated by Martina Vandenberg, who I've known for 15 plus years. So, good afternoon. At Calvert, our mission is to change and improve the world through the power of investments. We run about 40 mutual funds, and we only invest in companies which meet decent, reasonable standards of commitment and performance with respect to labor rights and human rights, including how companies treat workers throughout their supply chains. We believe that companies have a fundamental responsibility not only for their own employees in their own operations, but through their suppliers throughout the entire supply chain around the world. It's a heavy responsibility, but significant progress has been made over the last dozen plus years, as the introductory film highlighted, by a number of companies, and I particularly appreciated the examples of Apple on bonded labor and Intel really across its supply chains, two companies that we at Calvert and other ethical and responsible investors have engaged and encouraged over the years. Calvert is not alone among investors on both sides of the Atlantic, and indeed a growing number of investors around the world who look for labor and human rights policy commitments, who look for basic systems of codes and compliance, who look for auditing and monitoring, who look for human rights impact assessments. We're also not alone in worrying about the efficacy, the positive impact of those audits, some of which have been corrupted or degraded over time. We also care a lot about worker voice, We want to hear directly, unfiltered, what workers and their families, their communities are experiencing, including on human trafficking issues. That said, I want to make a key point here this afternoon based on our experience at Calvert and my own experience over the years working on labor and human rights issues on behalf of government, the US government, and working closely with NGOs as I do, as well as with companies. And that proposition is that corporate responsibility, corporate accountability for labor and human rights is absolutely necessary, but at the same time, it is not sufficient on its own. We cannot and must not, in my view, rely mostly, let alone solely, on corporate responsibility. We have to depend as well on government responsibility, on public policy, on law, on legislation, on regulation. And that's why we at Calvert have come together with other investors and with NGOs to support, as we have very strongly and effectively, the enactment and now the implementation of Section 1502 of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Law that requires companies listed in US stock exchanges to disclose due diligence efforts to root out traces of conflict minerals from their supply chains. But when it comes to this issue, to human trafficking, that same proposition is also at work for us. That's why Calvert's taken a leading role in the global coalition to end forced labor, including child labor, in the cotton fields of Uzbekistan. And we don't just go after companies and their supply chains, we go right after the government of Uzbekistan, and we press the US government and the EU to turn the screws on Tashkent, and we work in Geneva with the ILO, and we will not rest until forced labor ends in Uzbekistan. We also, for the same reason, work with other investors and NGOs in supporting the California Supply Chain Disclosure Act that began to set a standard in the US. It's the same reason why Calvert was among 24 other signatories, investor signatories, to a statement released just this week supporting the Modern Slavery Act here in the UK. And we look to leadership from this government here on this side of the Atlantic. And my pledge to you today on behalf of Calvert is to work tirelessly next year in 2015 and beyond with friends and allies in the investment world and the NGO world, and Jean and her allies, others in Washington and across America, to enact sooner rather than later the trafficking legislation that we need in the United States of America. We've got to set an example and lead as well on our side of the Atlantic. So that's our commitment for 2015. We've got to pass that legislation, and we will not stop. It's not just corporate accountability, it's government responsibility.
Yeah. Thank you, Bennett. So I want to pick up right where Bennett left off, which is the rule of law and the theme of this entire conference. And when you look at the statistics released by the Department of State in their Trafficking in Persons report in 2014, they do a head count of how many prosecutions there are around the world. And for all of the forced labor in the world, which we know is the vast majority of trafficking and slavery in the world, the head count of prosecutions in the entire world for forced labor is 1,199 in the world. 1,199 prosecutions for forced labor. So I want to turn to Renato, because Bennett, you brought up this question of sort of government responsibility. Renato, you work for the government of Brazil, although you're independent as a labor advisor. Can you explain how this accountability has had legs in Brazil, and what can countries learn from Brazil?
Yeah, I think, there's one reflection that we need to put here. With this new schemes of subcontracting, it's another problem of prosecutions, because always when you talk about forced labor within supply chains, the one who is being sued is one middleman, not only that's the main point of it. Hardly you will sue, you will prosecute someone who's in a higher position, which takes the governments not to opt to prosecute these people, which I don't agree, of course, but still there's a large road to legal liability if you want to talk about it. But Brazil has a very interesting policy, which is, I just mentioned the dirty list. Maybe that's why you're referring, right? Which is based totally in a name and shame policy. Once a company, it's not prosecution, it's not criminal, but still, it has a major impact on supply chains because the companies really matter. They really don't want to be on the dirty list. Once an inspection is fulfilled, once an inspection is realized, and some corporation is made liable for this or that case of forced labor, they go to this dirty list for 2 years, and of course, it's a huge damage to their image. They don't want to. We had a case there in Brazil. It was very rumorous, and it involved Zara. We rescued 52 Bolivian migrant workers from one sweatshop in 2011, but ever since Zara has been fighting with us. Zara has been suing the Brazilian Ministry of Labor in order not to be in the dirty list. And things are still going on. We are still investigating them in order to understand what happened to their supply chain afterwards. So these different measures really work. I think we need a set of different measures. We need more prosecutions, criminal prosecutions. We need more labor prosecutions. We need more administrative measures. We need a set of different measures, basically.
So Renato, it's interesting because I think when we think corporate responsibility and corporate accountability, we're thinking voluntary. And people are signing up for voluntary codes of conduct and voluntary audits. But Jean, I want to turn to you for a moment because there are a lot of people in my community, the victims' rights community, who are very convinced now that we need a different approach, not necessarily voluntary, but something that looks more like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this is the perennial carrot and the stick argument, because I do come down up front on the side of a voluntary approach by companies, so they really address the issue. They don't get caught up in the cottage industry of reporting, but they actually work to address the issue. That being said, at some point, the stick comes into play. And I have a different view on the California Transparency Act. I have a more jaded view on that act, because any act that compliance is, I didn't do anything, is a problem for me. Which is basically, you can comply with the California Transparency Act and basically say, I have not done any of these things, because it's just a matter of reporting it. Now, I quickly get into a big debate with my State Department friends that it started a dialogue, it started some discussion and all that. But then I turned and I started talking about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for those of you who don't know, makes it unlawful to make a payment to a foreign official to get business. But what's really important about that act is it has huge fines, huge penalties, including going to jail, for both individuals and corporations. So if you want to make it count, you can, have your fun with the California Transparency Act, but if you want to make it count, the stick ought to be something like a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. You get an FCPA charge in your office, it goes straight to the chairman. The chairman has you all in his office. He wants to understand what's going to happen because there's going to be a fine, there's going to be potential for prison, and some of the fines have been extraordinary. I can think of a large company, $1.6 billion. I can think of an electronic company this past year, $500 million. That counts. And why in the world is it more important to fight corruption than slavery? I mean, think about that, right? It can't possibly be more important. I can't think of a more important thing to fight than the slavery of another human being. So I believe that we have to move. Now, this is not winning friends in the business arena, because FCPA is a big deal when you get investigated. It's millions of pages get scanned and submitted, but I think it's the right answer in this fight.
So there are those companies that have signed up for various principles, such as the Athens Ethical Principles or SEDEX. Louise, I wanted to turn to you for a moment. In terms of what impact this carrot that Jean talks about has had, what impact do you think that the voluntary principles have had, and what do you think about this FCPA option?
Okay, I've got to start with a bit of open disclosure. I sit on the board of SEDEX, so I obviously start from a very pro view of SEDEX. I was also involved in the setting up of SEDEX, and why did we set it up? We set it up because I was hugely frustrated that as I went around visiting sites on the ground that had very, very little resource, they were spending so much time trying to understand all the different customers' codes of conduct. And to prepare for multiple audits, that what we were trying to do was to encourage more businesses to work with us, try and get more businesses to give one clear message down the supply chain that said ethical practices matter and that they're important to our business with you. There is a common code that we're all operating to. Have one audit and share it with your customers. I think it's not the system that's broke, it's the way that brands use the system that's broke. What we need is, as I say, those brands not just to have an audit and to relinquish all responsibility to the third party, but to use that audit as part of a detailed ethical trade monitoring program. So they look at that audit, they really spend time understanding the issues that have been raised on that audit, following that up with the intelligence they have from on-the-ground visits, and making sure that they're really focused on addressing the real root causes of the issues that are raised. So for us, an example that relates directly back to labour, exploitative modern-day slavery labour, was about understanding that what we needed to do was to work with the labour providers, not instead to see them as the enemy, those third-party recruiters of labour, but instead to bring them in, work with them with our suppliers. What does a responsible labour user look like? What does a responsible labour provider look like? Help them form an association. And for the first 4 years, the Association of Labour Provider had their AGMs at M&S's head offices, because actually we wanted them to be a body that had a voice and that was clearly working on how do we drive a really effective approach to the recruitment of third-party labour.
But you're way ahead of this, Louise. I mean, you started 15 years ago working on this. So what was the initial spark or the initial impetus that caused Marks & Spencer to start taking this more seriously?
Well, I think a recognition that we needed to do a better job of it, and that was a good reason to focus on it. What have we learnt 15 years on? We've learnt that labour issues are intrinsically linked to great quality product, and that actually what we know is that if you're in an environment where you feel safe, you feel that your health and safety is protected, you feel that you're going to be adequately rewarded, you're given the right level of training, you're given help to address perhaps those issues that are outside the workplace, that meaning you're coming to work with a head full of worries. If we can address those, we will drive better productivity in factories, better consistent quality product that delights more of our customers.
So Simon, I want to turn to you for a moment, because Lush ultimately decided that mica was hopeless. Right, that you abandoned mica. So can you talk a little bit about the process that caused you to realize that working with someone at that stage in the supply chain just wasn't going to be a possibility?
Well, for us, we kind of traced back through an audit process to have a look at what sort of access can we have to the mines and to see them. That's a core question. Can we visit? When people say no, normally you get a bit of an alarm bell. And then we asked, have you been audited? Yes, we've been audited. Okay. The audit team seemed very happy that the fact they'd taken 100 armed guards into the mine first to see the mine. And straight away, we're like, no, this isn't good. There's no way that we can actually, hand on heart, say, oh yeah, it's been audited, there's no child labour and stuff when you have an instance like that. So actually that was quite straightforward, because we didn't have enough volume to be working necessarily with an entire mine to work on how do we increase the standards, how do we remove children and slaves from that industry. You know, we just didn't have the scale for that. So instead we then looked around for an alternative supply, and we went for that instead. And we are lucky that there was an alternative and that we can use it. We're not always that lucky, and it makes it very difficult if you're using materials that you then subsequently find out you're not happy with. And we have had instances, palm oil was another one, where on visiting Sumatra, we realised actually it's probably not that great to be cutting down this rainforest and just planting palm. Plus the knock-on effect was migrant labour, potential bonded labour, things like that. So we decided to remove that from our supply chain as well, but there weren't alternatives, and we had to work with suppliers. Luckily, we did have enough volume to finally encourage suppliers to give us an alternative. But it's not always that easy. So yeah, I think mica is a good example that sometimes boycotting that to say no, we're not going to buy it. Other times we really prefer to have a more positive and kind of collaborative approach. We're really trying to build relationships with suppliers, longer term relationships for exactly the same reasons, that you can have happy people in making happy soap is what we always say, but in terms of everybody down that supply chain is enjoying the work they're doing, they're getting paid fairly for it, and it's truly sustainable for everybody.
Livia, I want to turn to you on this question of audits, because audits is the magic word that haunts everyone's speech when they talk about corporate accountability in this area. And we've read about audits that have been thwarted. For example, one article in the New York Times where the auditors paid a surprise visit to the company, and the music in the workroom changed, and it was code, and all the children knew as soon as that music came on that they should run out the back door. And so when the auditor did the audit, magically there were no children there because they had all heard the coded music. Are there examples that you've seen in the field where audits have been thwarted, or do you have a sense of how the fashion industry can go beyond audits?
Well, audits sometimes are used as an excuse by the fashion companies to, delegate responsibility to the auditors rather than to them directly. It's very impressive to hear someone who has runs a business and goes to Kenya to meet the farmers. It doesn't happen very often. Most CEOs of big fashion brands, I'm sure, never went to the countries where they produce their clothes. But they do audits, of course, and then they rely on reporting from the audits. So then if a disaster happens, say, oh, but it's not our fault, we didn't know. We did audits. So if you, as a business, you really want, and it taps also into what you were saying, that social and corporate responsibility cannot stay a box to tick for companies in reporting. You really have to go on the ground and, pick up your sleeves to address supply chain issues as slavery. Sometimes for a company, particularly for fashion, they have very, very, as I said at the beginning, complicated supply chain, can feel like, and excuse me for the not very appealing example, but like eating an elephant. So how do you eat an elephant? You can't eat it in one bite. It's not very ethical. Thank you. We work together, this is what she said. You have to cut it into pieces. So businesses it takes a long time for businesses. Marks & Spencer have been doing it for 15 years with this impressive Plan A, because they said there's no Plan B. So we have to implement what we have and do it properly. In the case of Bangladesh, then there is new auditing for safety regulations, so the Bangladeshi Fire Code, which it's very important that it's been set up, but again, it's very flawless because brands tick the box of, we signed to the agreement, to the accord, so now we gave this money to compensate the victims. But is things changing in the ground? Not really. And they're doing the safety inspection on less than 2,000 factories. Bangladesh has more than 6,000. And then when they found a factory that most likely doesn't tick the box of health and safety, then where do the workers go when they close the factory? How are they paid? And who pays for repairing the factory? No one can answer that yet. So auditing is it's very important that companies, but it is only relevant and important when companies really take it through and take the auditing process in their hands rather than delegating it to someone else.
Jean, I want to come back to you because you've had the experience of trying to look at a supply chain that is layers and layers and layers and layers deep. So how, as a responsible sort of corporate leader, how do you actually go all the way to the very bottom of the supply chain and look at, for example, mica or coltan or something like that?
Well, first of all, if you have a supply chain that is a couple $100 billion, and and you might have 400,000 suppliers, the idea that you're going to perfectly go through that whole supply chain is ridiculous. So back to the whole idea of the toolkit is you've got to have a heat map, and you've got to start to prioritize. However, once you do that, there's no excuse not to go all the way through. And I was on a panel with a bunch of business folks in New York recently in which they said it's totally unrealistic to do that. And I said, no, it's not. You can do it. You can't do it everywhere. But I had an example of a supply chain for a particular flange, which it went, and it had to do with metallurgy and a whole host of things. It went 12 deep. 12 deep, from a big EPC contractor all the way down till we finally get to bad metallurgy and bad welding, 12 deep. And that was a $3 million spend, not very big for us. And you begin to realize that you have to do that across the board. But look, how do you run a business? You run a business on risk. You run the financial aspect of your business on risk. You run everything else on risk. You run your supply chain on risk. So figure out where there's the biggest risk of forced labor, and then you go after it, and you watch it all the way down. I have a decidedly different view on audits, maybe because I'm jaded in that the audits I've seen have been largely used by companies under the gun to respond to being under the gun. I think there's an extraordinary place for good audits, and I can think of my friend in Verite, what a wonderful job they do with audits. But that's after a company has committed to recreating real sound procurement processes that eliminate the problem. You don't get to just go to an audit and say, look, I'm clean now. You have to have systemic change. So I think that becomes really relevant. And I'm a big fan of ESRs, Enhanced Supplier Relationships, or RSM, Supplier Relationship Management. It's a little acronym, geeky talk for procurement, but where you get to know your suppliers and you force them to go all the way to the base.
Because one can argue with the very thing that a supply chain is made of 400 different suppliers.
400,000.
Yeah, 400,000. It's like, how did it get so messy? So it is important.
It is, but you can do it. And I think that's for those of us who have run supply chains, that's what we have to get in and insist that we get technical with people so they don't get off the hook. The other thing is, and I know this is going to be really controversial, I'll probably get rotten eggs from my panel here, is that part of the problem too are CSR organizations. Because
corporate social responsibility.
Corporate social responsibility. They're really important in terms of policy, but you have to get your ops people, your operations folks, and your procurement folks.
It's another huge industry.
Absolutely on board, because they're the ones who spend the money. And it's like saying that the only people who care about safety is your safety department, or the only people that care about environment is your environmental department. Until you get your operations folks and your procurement folks on board, nothing really happens.
So Bennett, I want to ask you about eating the elephant and how you actually increase and how you actually sort of begin to tackle this this problem that Livia has pointed out, that this seems like such a huge problem. How do you actually, I think, create greater risks for companies that have filthy supply chains? And what can we do to incentivize better behavior? What can shareholders do, for example?
I think shareholders have to bang the drum that we, and not just Calvert, have been banging, that it's just unacceptable in the 21st century world to tolerate supply chains that abuse labor and human rights and that tolerate trafficking, among other abuses. We just have to make this morally, politically, and economically unacceptable. And we have the power to make it economically unacceptable through the allocation of our investments. I want to come back, though, to the point about auditing and also pick up on a point I'd made earlier, but others had about worker voice. And I think the point of panels like this is to sometimes say something that may be unpopular, and I'm going to say something right now that will strike people as being antiquated. But Rana Plaza tells me more than ever that one of the great inventions, not inventions of the 20th century, the 19th century, but one of the great accomplishments of the 20th century, namely free trade unions, needs to be given much greater respect in importance in the 21st century. And I'll tell you, trade unions, like other institutions in all of our societies, have had their share of inefficiencies, of corruption, of poor management. But God help us to live in a world without trade unions. And what really reminded me, more than any incident in recent years, we're reading account after Rana Plaza, of workers desperately in the weeks, days, and even hours leading up to the collapse of that structure, trying to get their voice across to management. They had no channel. They had no mechanism. And that's the best argument to me for why we need unions in workplaces. Obviously, we're for freedom of association, for the right of workers to choose whether or not to be represented by trade unions. But it seems to me that in the garment and apparel business, that workers are well served by unions. And let's not overlook one of the great achievements of the 20th century now in the 21st. We actually need unions more than ever.
We do. It reminds me, actually, Bennett, of one of my favorite bumper stickers, which is remember the unions and thank them for the invention of the weekend.
Yep.
Unfortunately, the weekend has not yet been invented in places like Rana Plaza. And one of the things that I think the whole Rana Plaza disaster brings up is this issue of corruption. So I wonder if, Livia, maybe you and Bennett could address this question of sort of how corruption feeds into this problem. I don't know who wants to start. Livia?
You start.
Yeah. Go ahead, Livia,
I mean,
please.
corruption obviously feeds into the problem by providing a economic incentive on top of moral laxity that permits these terrible abuses. And we've got to crack down on corruption. That said, as much of an American optimist as I am, I'm not that optimistic about fundamentally altering human nature anytime soon. And I think for that reason, and I really have no difference with Jean here, why we need to treat, as she so eloquently said, slavery just as we do corruption through something like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We need that. And, you know, there's a lot of debate about the efficacy of compliance approaches, and it doesn't really translate through a company unless it changes its culture. That's right, but you've got to start someplace, and compliance is a way of getting into the belly of the beast here. But ultimately, we have to work to change incentives, behavior, and ultimately character, because this is fundamentally about ethics, and we have to get there even if it's not going to be easy.
So Livia and then Louise, and then we're going to turn to the audience for questions, so please start thinking of your questions. Go ahead, Livia.
Well, in the case of Bangladesh, where, by the way, the women now are starting to form unions. The problem is that the factory workers don't recognize them, but that's another story. They're trying, so there must be a way to help them to achieve that. But more than corruption, it seems to me that the real problem is a lack of ownership, of responsibility, because the government of Bangladesh have been delegated their responsibility on the trade association to regulate the market. The companies, the brands have been, relying putting the responsibility on the governments or on the factory owners. The factory owners just trying to, make a living, and then it gets put on, on the plate in order for 1.5 million shorts for 25p each that has to be delivered in 4 days, and has to deal with that. So it has one factory, but then it can subcontract to other three, doesn't even know what they are, but, and starts whipping but whose responsibility is it? Is it the factory owner? I don't know. I don't think so. I'm not sure it's correct. And we always go back to the responsibility lies on the brands and the businesses. I mean, even the UN on minimum living wages says that, it should be a partnership between government and business, but where the government is not able to guarantee a living wage, it should lie on the business. So there are regulations, there are, fundamental truth put in place. It's just no one respects them. And even, what is a living wage? How do you define an acceptable living wage? You know, no one has answered that question. And we go back to what Nasma asked me, it's like, why my life is cheaper than yours? Louise, did you want to?
Well, I wanted to come back on Bennett's point about worker voice and just bring us back to slavery, because I think this is really important, and just thinking about the UK context. So in the UK context, we tried a voluntary a way of auditing labour providers and third-party brokers. We realised that wasn't enough. The Morecambe Bay disaster happened, and that helped the NGOs and trade unions and corporates under the auspices of the Ethical Trading Initiative to come together with MPs to lobby for the Gangmaster Licensing Authority. But we were still looking at issues of labour exploitation happening here in the UK, even when we had an enforcement agency in place. And that led last year to again, the brands coming back around the table and saying, what can we do? We're just not hearing the voices of these ghosts. And that led to us forming something called Stronger Together, which was saying that we need to raise awareness of these individuals who are so frightened and who don't know where to go and seek help. And so I urge you to go and have a look at the Stronger Together website. That's the purpose of that was to make sure that we spread out more messages about how to reach these vulnerable people. So we've trained 500 so factory managers. They have then gone back and they've reached 250,000 workers, and the messages there are to help people playing a video. It's a toolkit, it's the fact sheets on what to look for in terms of these vulnerable people, so that those workers can go back into their community and help to identify where these vulnerable victims lie.
Thank you. So let's go out. Are there questions on the floor? Yes, please. I think we'll take 2 or 3, and then we'll have the panel answer. So one here, and then can we get a microphone over here as well, please?
My name's Imelda Poole, and I'm representing 2 organisations of anti-trafficking. Sorry, yes, here I am.
Yeah, please do stand up.
Okay. One is across... I'm small. Yeah.
It's hard to see you out there.
It's very dark.
One is anti-trafficking across Europe, it's called Renato, and the other is in Albania, where I've lived for 10 years. And in Albania, I'm speaking now for Albania, but also the stories that have come from our network in places like Romania, Prague, Slovakia, and so on. It would seem that in post-communist countries, and I wanted to speak today because I don't think there are many here from East Europe. And I think it has a particular flavour and culture and situation that is hugely stifled and hugely corrupt. So if you are in a country where, and I loved what was said about you need to get the governments on board, if you're in a country where law is not implemented, where labour is cheap, where unemployment is 50+%, where the population, the average age is 35, you've got trouble. And I really would like somebody to address the situation of fear, deceit, and corruption that comes forth from a culture of oppression, and which therefore absolutely makes all of the people of such a country slaves in one way or another.
Yeah. Thank you for that excellent question. Let's go. Yes, please.
Very good.
Let's take a few questions. Why don't we go over here, please?
My name is Karen Friedman-Agnifilo. I'm a prosecutor in New York. I work for Cyrus Vance. But my question is more as just a consumer. I have a question. How do we get awareness out as to which brands, especially in the fashion industry, which are the ones we shouldn't purchase? What are the products we shouldn't buy? Because I know people like me sure wouldn't do that. I'm not going to go to Zara anymore. And
we don't need 10,000 looks every year.
But I do think that could make a difference, because there's a lot of people, especially in the U.S., a lot of consumers, and I think if you know the demand, if you hit them with the demand side as well, I think that might make a difference. So I just wonder how you can get the word out.
So that's excellent. So let's start with this question of sort of no rule of law. Maybe sort of sounds similar to Uzbekistan, Bennett. Do you want to start off on sort of what do you do in countries where there's no rule of law?
I just want to compliment, though, the questioner who really who very eloquently put their finger on an issue here that, I think, I haven't lived in an authoritarian country, but I've certainly worked in many as a former U.S. human rights diplomat and in other capacities. And I think that there's just a total degradation of society that occurs from when there's political repression at the top and it encourages certain behaviors. That said, what we also see in authoritarian societies are courageous people fighting for freedom, fighting for democracy and human rights, and as the case in the former Soviet bloc, at least the Eastern European part of it, largely achieving democracy and human rights. Uzbekistan is a very tough nut to crack here because it's a country whose political system changed from communism to a kind of hyper state-driven uber capitalism, but still maintaining the command and control structures, if you will, of the communist state, above all in the cotton sector. And the regime continues to rule through a combination of fear and repression, but also economic incentives that compel certain officials in particular to maintain this system of forced labor. Forced labor in the cotton sector, not to excuse it, but to explain it, persists partly because it's been so embedded in the culture of Uzbekistan for decades now, beginning early in the Soviet era. So this is a very tough nut to crack.
Part of the school holidays.
Yeah, it did start as school holidays, and I think the pressure from our campaign has resulted now, as the ILO reported last year, to more or less ending child labor, at least labor of younger children. There's still labor of some teenagers, but overwhelmingly still of adults. But this is an example of a problem that has complex, intertwined political, economic, and cultural strands to it. And we're trying to unravel those strands through a combination of engagement with the government, but also, frankly, pressure through the ILO, which is at the same time trying to help lift standards, but we're pursuing another route to the ILO, which is to sanction Uzbekistan if they don't make quicker progress here. But it's a very tough nut to crack. And again, I really want to commend the questioner for such a critical point for all of us.
I think Jean wanted to add something.
Well, having traveled in all those countries plus Azerbaijan, this is a really extremely difficult thing. Mm-hmm. And I believe the reason why slavery hasn't been really annihilated is because of the profit motive. Mm-hmm. And that $250 billion that's out there, it's very hard to fight. So from my vantage point, you got to come back to businesses. You've got to make sure they reduce the demand, cut the demand to zero in those countries. Their need for trade turns around, and make sure that other countries around it cut trade. So the only way to go after them is from a macroeconomic perspective, I believe, and that takes political will from other countries.
But businesses go into these countries precisely because it's cheap.
They do, but here's the other thing about businesses. We have to get businesses to start thinking about this in total system cost terms.
Yeah.
And if you think in total system cost terms, you begin to understand productivity, and we're working right now on what's the economic cost of a slave. I think you find in the medium term and the long term, you come out on the short end of the stick. You get superior returns. It's one of the things we're doing with Tao, trying to invest down at the base of a supply chain to show that you can get superior returns by doing the right thing. There might be a short period of time in which you incur a little bit different costs because you got to invest. But I believe that curve might go a little like this, but then the slope of that curve goes up. And we have to get businesses to start thinking about it.
And also, it's the right thing to be doing. You always have to come back to that point that there's an ethic to it. But one of the points I was going to pick up on was that if there are individuals within a country or in an oppressive regime or somewhere that are struggling and that they're trying to fight against that, you can also support it. So, for instance, it's not in the region we're talking about, but in Colombia, we've for the last 5 years, we've been buying cocoa direct from a peace community, which is 2,000 individuals who stepped out of the cycle of violence in that region, where they were caught between paramilitaries and the government and all sorts of other interests. Mostly those interests were trying to displace people so they could get access to the minerals on that land. And what we've tried to provide is a more holistic approach where we say actually in the longer term there's more value to people staying on that land, growing crops, and actually being happy. And
So Livia, can you address this question that Karen
Yeah.
has asked about how we, and also Simon, if you want to address this,
Yeah.
how do you actually figure out which companies to boycott, which brands have already sort of raced to the bottom and should be avoided?
Well, first of all, I'm not a huge fan of boycotting. And take a step back.
I am.
No, but
Sorry.
in terms, the problem is, take a step back, and before you even go into boycotting, think about how many things you bought this year. You know, from 1st of January until today, how many things you bought. And that you find your answer. There are millions of brands that work in an ethical way, and even on a Google click, you'll find them. Brands that are better than others. Marks & Spencer in the UK, I'm a huge fan because they're doing fantastic work. And I'm not very fashionable. Well, they're getting more fashionable too. They're just, on the Times today, I was looking at the new looks. They're rock. The new fashion collection rock. But it's more about, you know, how do we send the message to fast fashion businesses? The H&M, the Primark, the Zara, the Mango, you name, we could spend the whole list, that we are not up for business as usual. They have to change the business model. They have to stop producing all this crap. Otherwise, we're not going to change anything. And even going to the depleting of, first of all, I think, and someone one day hopefully will prove it, that the financial business model is finite because they're depleting the earth resources. I mean, if you think that to produce one pair of jeans, you need between 11 and 20,000 liters of water for one pair of jeans, that, you know, the aerial sea has become a desert because of cotton. So there's not going to be much more to go. And slavery, hopefully, won't be, you know, we'll find a way to tackle it, but only if, as consumer, we say, that's it.
By boycotting, you cut that economic model down straight away. So
Yeah,
if they don't have the money, there isn't the money. Okay, I'm not going to buy anything with cotton from Uzbekistan.
But then you're taking the
And it
women
cuts
of
it down.
Bangladesh out of work.
Also, there are, we work with Ethical Consumer quite a lot, and they do quite a thorough job in terms of listing down companies and ranking them ethically, and they take into account all of their actions, not just one particular action. So there are good organisations out there, and they do encourage boycott as well. If an organisation hasn't moved on something for a number of years, then they need a kick up the arse.
So
You know
Karen,
what I mean? And that's financial.
Karen, I think you should go to one of the action groups because an action of creating a consumer strike group to go after brands is
That
an
would be
excellent
very
idea.
powerful.
So that can be your action. So we need to take a lot more questions. So let's get a mic around. Let's get one here and one with the paper in the air, and then to Ben.
Hello, I'm Anu George Kanjanathopil. I work with International Justice Mission. International Justice Mission does a whole lot of amazing work. I would recommend that you go online and find out. I don't have the time to talk about it now. I will be specific to what I do in India. So in India, my team works in identifying and rescuing and rehabilitating slaves. So I'm very interested and excited. We do this with the government, right? And we have also gotten into industries where there's bone crushing to make toothpaste. There is also weaving, which gets into, so that there's a textiles industries right there. We have also been successful in finding out the supply chain and the government taking action in ensuring that every single person gets paid through the bank. All right, but when I'm thinking about supply chain, I'm talking about I'm wondering what happens in a place like India where bricks are getting manufactured. I mean, the supply chain is internal. You're talking about what happens internationally if it comes from one country to another. Hundreds of thousands of people, families are being invested in being trafficked for months on end, 22 hours, day in, day out. I've personally seen what they go through. I mean, every sort of violent oppression happens within this brick lane. So what is the solution really? I mean, I know phenomenal women who are sitting on the panel here. All good credit to the men there, but these amazing women, I would love to hear if you do have a solution.
Excellent question. Okay, there was another question right here. So the question was sort of, what do you do about domestic production. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Alicia Miranda. I'm with the Thomson Reuters Foundation. But also, as a consumer, I just want to echo Karen's point, and I think that Calvert has been amazing in the sense that as a mainstream investor with not a huge amount of money, I can go onto a mainstream investment site like Fidelity and buy Calvert funds. And that makes it very easy for me to know that someone has vetted them and I'm investing well. And I do not think, I have seen all the indices, I work in this field, and so I've done my research. And what you hear from all the firms, it's very complicated. Supply chains are complicated. Here are 45 indicators that you should look at. I don't have time to look at 45 indicators. So I would like to just kind of echo that point. I don't think that question has been answered. And I do think people want some kind of simple solution into thinking, where should I shop? Where should I go buy things? And then I do think people would move if they knew. But after Rana Plaza, I spent a couple weeks trying to look into the brands that I shop at. And it was impossible. It was absolutely impossible to get any clear answers. So I just want to kind of echo that point, and I'll be in the action group as well.
It's very clear that that the complicated nature actually serves the traffickers. So let's address this question very quickly about what you do about trafficking within the domestic supply chain. So bricks that are sort of being moved within India. Jean, do you want to?
So I've spent some time on the ground in both Nepal and India in the brick kilns. And the last time I was in one of the largest brick kilns in Nepal, as I was hiking out, I was quickly doing the calculation. Okay, for $250,000, I could save everybody in this brick kiln done. And then within a second, I thought, this is the stupidest idea I've ever had. Because as soon as I do that, they go back to the source village. The source mafia traffics them probably into worse circumstances. So in most cases, brick kilns are a local product market. So as a result of that, I think it gets back to this replacement economy. We're going to have to figure out with the governments, and part of what we're trying to do with the fund is going to bring pressure to bear on governments to begin to build replacement economies that fairly work with workers in these areas. These are workers for whom, back to the trade unions, I don't think trade unions are necessarily the right approach with brick kilns. These are workers, the kids are sick, they have never spent money on buying food or a place to live because they've had all that done for them. They are truly slaves, and it's the worst form of slavery. So we need governments fully engaged on this, I believe.
So Renato, you're sort of representing a government. So what do you see with sort of internal trafficking within Brazil? How would you address this problem?
I think we don't need to feel pity for industries or brands. It's just like the industries are very dynamic. Once an industry goes down, comes another one. So you have to substitute it. It's just simple as that. Like to invest in knowledge, substitute this industry for another one, maybe more profitable, that generates decent work. It's as simple as that.
Mm-hmm. So other questions, I think we have time for maybe just a couple more questions. Let me get a mic there, and then one here, and then Ben. Where are the mics? Please. Whoever gets it first should go. It's a race. Okay, you've got yours. Please go ahead.
So, hi everyone, my name is Archana. I work with Liberty Asia, which is an anti-trafficking charity based in Southeast Asia. And my heart really goes back to a comment that Emma Bonino made yesterday about the undocumented people. It's becoming increasingly fashionable for a huge reliance on temporary and migrant forces. And I'm thinking in particular about the seafood packing industry in Thailand, which relies very heavily on people from Laos and from Burma. Many of those are undocumented. Many, even those who are documented, find it very difficult because of the way the Thai government operates to actually avail themselves of legal protections that might be available to them under other circumstances. So in that context, we've talked a lot about corporate accountability mechanisms, procurement systems, this, that, and other. And I was really pleased to hear the comment about the trade unions. But what else can corporations do to support worker empowerment? This is not just about a top-down approach. It has to be bottom-up too. And at some point, you both need to meet halfway. That's my first, sorry, I'm going to be naughty and ask a two-part question.
Make it quick.
I'll make it quick. And on the question of the living wage, I'm really glad you brought that up too, because for many corporations, they pay the statutory minimum wage. And while that is legal and they can perfectly get away with it, it doesn't solve the problem of the local guy who can't live on it. So he gets indebted so he can feed his family and get by on a daily basis. And as we all know, debt is the shackles and chains of the 1950s today. So that person gets into a situation of servitude as a result of that debt. So do we need to be talking a bit more about the living wage, and should we be forcing the discussion that way?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, please. Who has the mic on this side, please?
Hello, my name's Layla. Not very accomplished yet, but I do wanted to.
You're here. You're accomplished. That's an accomplishment.
Thank you. International studies student, and so I kind of try to make all of this very simple for me. And one thing I was thinking about throughout the day is corporations and their role. How do we figure out who is held accountable within that corporation, within that supply chain? Is it one person? Is it two people? Also, I was thinking about the comparison between a pimp and a corporation. So essentially, a pimp enslaves, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of women. And a corporation can enslave an entire country of women, you know? And so I think it's interesting that corporations can be prosecuted and get a slap on the hand with a fine. Like the ability to be fined and get away with it is something that's very interesting to me. And I wonder if making an example of these companies as they are doing more, their impact is very much the same as a pimp impact kind of thing. So I just wonder where does that lie, and how could we make examples that would be more, I guess, clear to the public?
So I think it's a question of accountability. So the last question goes to Ben. Our time is very nearly up, so Ben, please make it very, very brief.
Of course. Okay.
Very brief.
Well, first of all, thanks, Jean, for the kind words about Tao. You showed everybody why we're proud to have you as an operating partner. The question is a slightly cantankerous one, drawing from my life as an investigative journalist. But it seems like we're having a Western-facing conversation on what is increasingly an Eastern-facing problem. The questions about consumption are well placed, but when China is going to be the largest retail market in the world in 2016, when it's already by some measures the largest economy, when China and India and Indonesia uptake so many of the products where there are these problems, where's the campaigns? Where is the conversation with the Chinese consumers, with the Indian consumers, with the Indonesian consumers, with the Asian consumers? Well, that's not a satisfying answer. We need to get that started.
No, but I can tell you, I spoke to a lot of Chinese people. They don't even, it doesn't even scratch the surface. They don't understand it yet. And in fact, when it happens to me, I come back home and I think, I might as well retire. There's no point.
One quick counterpoint on that. McKinsey surveys of Chinese consumers, Tsinghua University surveys, Reuter-Finn surveys, show that they will actually pay more for environmentally well-sourced products and for safe products. You look at one of the largest trafficked items in China today is baby formula. Is there a transparency argument that can be made here?
So can I just
Livia,
answer quickly?
We briefly have to
about
cover
the
these. We have 2
consumer
minutes.
thing, because she's right. I feel like I haven't answered it properly. But I realize there's a huge generational issue here, because I'm 45, and when I grew up as a student, as my early 20s, fast fashion didn't exist. So the way that I shop is very different from a 20, 15, 25-year-old today. Today, I just read, I was thinking, what am I wearing? My Stella McCartney trousers, I had them for 4 years. My Cami Organic jackets, I had it for 6 years. And they were quite expensive, but if I do the price per wear, they cost 2p in a shop. So I shop in such a different way, and this is what I can give you a name of brands where to go. People Tree, Patagonia does beautiful things. The Kering Group is doing amazing things. So Stella McCartney, Gucci, but it's not about who. It's about us as consumers, the way that we are consuming today. So you guys grew up in an era where H&M, Zara, Primark are on your doorstep. This is what you're used to. So you have to become more active, not in someone has to tell you, here you go and here you don't. Just become active citizens, buy differently, and make sure that, because you know these brands are not producing ethically, and they never will.
But companies can actually go out there and talk about these issues as well. And for us, we draw a lot of heat. It's not always good, but we campaign, and we campaign not just in the UK. We have shops all over the world, so in Japan and in Australia and Saudi, and we have to tailor those campaigns, but you can still talk to consumers and educate them and bring them in where they're at and take them back out knowing something new. And I think that's something exciting that brands can do as well.
Sadly, our time is now up, and I have to wrap up this brilliant panel, and everyone has lots more to say. Two things. I ask you to take all of your ideas to the action groups that follow first. And then second, for all the lawyers in the room, all of these questions of accountability, bring on the lawyers. Because some of the accountability comes through lawsuits and prosecutions. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to all of you. Thank you.